Hello, I'm Dr. Andrew Jenkin, a lecturer in sports management at the University of Stirling, and this is Sports Management 101, where we take a look at how sport actually operates behind the scenes. This week, I want to take a look at the Deloitte Football Money League. It came out in January and it's now into its 29th year. And there are some interesting things worth unpacking, both in this year's edition and in the nearly 30 years of data we can now draw upon. In this video, I want to cover what the list actually measures, why that matters, and some of the things it doesn't tell you. Because there's a tendency to look at this ranking and treat it as a measure of which clubs are the richest. And that's understandable, but it's not quite the full picture. And in understanding why this is, I think is a useful starting point for understanding football finance more broadly. Let's start with the basics. Deloitte is one of the so-called Big Four professional service firms, alongside PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, and KPMG. They operate globally, and their work spans audit, tax, consulting, and financial advisory. They've had a dedicated sports business group in the UK for decades, and the Football Money League, first published in 1997, has become one of the most referenced documents in football finance. It comes out every January, covering the financial year just completed. So the 2026 edition, published in January of this year, covers the 2024-2025 season. So why do they publish it? Partly because it builds profile and reputation in the sports sector. It positions them as the go-to firm for anyone serious about football finance. But it also genuinely serves the industry. Clubs, investors, broadcasters, and academics all use it as a reference point. It's also worth noting that Deloitte work with many of these clubs directly, providing audit, advisory, and consulting services. That doesn't make the data unreliable necessarily, but it's worth thinking about as useful context for understanding what the report is and isn't. So what does the report actually measure? Here's where we need to be slightly careful because the name itself can be misleading. The Deloitte Football Money League does not measure wealth, profit, or financial health. It measures revenue. Now, revenue is the total income a club generates from matchday sales, broadcasting distributions, and commercial activities like sponsorship, merchandise, and non-footballing events. It is, in accounting terms, the top line, the number before you subtract any of the costs associated with running the business. And there's an old saying in finance, and something football finance expert Kieran Maguire often quotes, which is, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity. And nowhere is that more true than in football. A higher position on this list tells you that a club is generating significant income. It doesn't tell you anything about whether that club is solvent, sustainable, or well run. And there's structural reasons for that. Former Tottenham Hotspur chairman Alan Sugar once described football's financial model as being like prune juice, in that money goes in and money comes straight back out. What he meant by that is increased revenue in football tends to get absorbed almost immediately, most often by player wages. So the money arrives and it leaves just as quickly, leaving clubs no more financially secure than before. So while the list tells us about how much money is flowing through these clubs, it doesn't tell us about whether these clubs are actually financially sustainable. Let's take a look at the data over time because the numbers are quite remarkable. When Deloitte published their very first Money League list, covering the 1997-1998 season, Manchester United were top, then at the height of their dominance under Sir Alex Ferguson, with revenues of approximately 132 million euros. If we fast forward to 2024-2025, and Real Madrid are now top with revenues of almost 1.6 billion euros. That's almost 9 times what Manchester United generated nearly 3 decades ago. Now, some of that reflects inflation. Prices in 1997 were much lower than today. And if you adjust Manchester United's 1997 revenues for inflation, you get to roughly 265 million euros in today's money. Real Madrid's figure is still more than 4 times that amount, meaning football has genuinely and substantially outpaced wider economic growth. So what explains this growth? And there's a few interlocking reasons for this worth exploring. Broadcasting revenue. The biggest single driver has been broadcasting. The Premier League launched in 1992 with a deal worth around £305 million over 5 years. The most recent domestic cycle runs to well over £5 billion for just 3 seasons, an increase of more than 15 times in nominal terms. And that's before international rights. The Premier League's broadcast product is now sold in almost every country in the world, with football becoming genuinely global entertainment, and the money that flows from that is reflected directly in these revenue figures. The 2026 Money League report notes that broadcast revenue now accounts for 38% of total revenue across the top clubs. And for the clubs ranked 11th to 20th, it's closer to half of everything they earn. Matchday income. Matchday revenue has also grown substantially, though it has a natural limit as there's only so many seats in any one ground. The 2026 report notes that this was the fastest growing revenue stream for the fourth consecutive year, hitting a record €2.4 billion across the top 20 clubs. Some of this growth comes from stadium redevelopments and expansions, some from a shift towards premium hospitality, and some from innovations like personal seat licenses, essentially selling the right to buy a season ticket, which Real Madrid and Barcelona have both used in conjunction with their own stadium projects. Commercial revenue. The third pillar, and increasingly the most important one for the biggest clubs, is commercial revenue. Sponsorship, merchandise, licensing, and a growing range of non-footballing activities now account for more than 40% of total revenue for the top clubs. What's particularly interesting is how clubs are now thinking about their stadiums and venues as assets that generate income 365 days a year, not just on match days. The 2026 Deloitte report notes that on-site breweries, restaurants, hotels, and other offerings are becoming more common, demonstrating how clubs are broadening in their revenue-generating activities well beyond what is happening on the pitch. Liverpool are a great example of this and now have physical retail stores in 21 locations globally. One of the most striking things in the data is just how dominant English clubs have become. In the 2024-25 Money League top 30, 15 of the clubs are from the Premier League. That's half the list. And collectively, those 15 clubs account for nearly half of all revenue generated by the top 30 combined. In 1997-98, there were 6 English clubs in the top 20. By 2024-25, 6 of the top 10 are English. Liverpool, for the first time in the Money League history, ranked as the highest revenue English club, driven by a return to the Champions League and significant commercial growth. This concentration of revenue in the Premier League isn't accidental. It reflects the scale of domestic broadcast deals, the global commercial appeal of English football, and sustained investment from international ownership. But it does raise questions. If financial resources are increasingly concentrated in one league, what does that mean for competitive balance across European football more broadly? And even within the Premier League, the gap between the clubs at the top of this list and those at the bottom is substantial. Brentford's €206 million sits well below Arsenal's €822 million, despite both competing in the same division. I want to spend a few moments on what the Money League doesn't tell us, because I think that is genuinely important. Revenue versus profitability. We've touched upon this already, but I think it's worth reinstating clearly. High revenue does not equate to financial health. Some of the clubs on this list operate at a loss. The ranking can give a misleading impression of financial strength, and the saying holds, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity. The recently published accounts for several clubs in this list make this point vividly. West Ham United recorded a pre-tax loss of £104 million in 2024-25, the worst financial year in the club's history. Chelsea's figures were even more stark, with UEFA data showing a pre-tax loss of around £355 million for the same season, the highest ever recorded by an English football club. It's worth noting that Chelsea's figure is partly driven by accounting entries rather than straightforward operational losses, but the broader picture is still clear enough. Both clubs appear in this year's Money League, neither made a profit. One-off transactions. The rankings sometimes include one-off revenue boosts that inflate a club's position in a given year without reflecting sustainable year-on-year income. Barcelona's return to the podium in this year's report was significantly boosted by personal seat licensing arrangements, generating around €70 million in a single year. That is unlikely to recur. It's income from selling a long-term right, not an ongoing operation of the club. Deloitte are transparent about this, but it's easy to overlook it when reading the headline rankings. Comparing apples with pears. One thing that's easy to miss is that Deloitte compile this data directly from clubs' own statements, which sounds straightforward, but clubs don't all account for things in exactly the same way. Revenue that one club classifies as commercial income might record differently elsewhere. Across 30 clubs from multiple countries, each operating under slightly different accounting conventions, you're not always comparing like with like. Deloitte are transparent about this and make adjustments where they can, but it's worth keeping in mind that this precision suggested by a rank list can mask some quite messy underlying data. Player welfare and the cost of growth. Finally, where is some of this revenue growth actually coming from? The 2026 report flags that Money League clubs played an average of 57 competitive matches in 24-25, up from 51 in the previous year. A significant part of the broadcast revenue growth came from the expanded Club World Cup. More matches mean more revenue, but there's also more physical demand on players, and there's a real tension here. Some of the growth we're looking at is being funded by asking players to play more football. That's not a model with infinite headroom, and it's a question football's governing bodies will need to confront more directly. Finance is not the same as value. And perhaps the deepest point of all, one raised by Stephen Morrow in The People's Game, is that the Money League measures financial flows, but says very little about value in any broader sense. A club's relationship with its community, its role in developing young players, its cultural significance to a city, none of that appears in a revenue figure. Stephen Morrow's framing is very useful here. Football clubs, he argues, are economic in basis but social in nature. The Money League captures one dimension of that, but doesn't capture the other. And that's not necessarily a criticism of the list, as it was never designed to measure those things. But it's a reminder that finance is just one lens and not always the most important one, depending on what question we're actually trying to answer. The Women's Football Money League. Before I close, I want to briefly mention something that Deloitte have started doing more recently, which is publishing a parallel list for women's football. This reflects a genuine shift in how the women's game is now being taken more seriously as a commercial entity, and it's worth acknowledging. What's particularly interesting is that the clubs at the top of the women's list are getting there by very different means. Arsenal women have operated long under a one club model, sharing infrastructure, commercial arrangements, and identity with the men's side. Chelsea women, by contrast, moved in 24-25 to operate as a more independent entity. Both approaches have produced commercial success, and as Deloitte note, that in itself is instructive. It demonstrates that there's currently no single blueprint for success in women's football. The industry is still relatively young, and clubs are experimenting with different models. What the women's list also shows is that the game is at an earlier stage of the trajectory we've been discussing. Revenue figures are smaller, but growth rates are significant, and the structural questions around sustainability, commercial development, and broadcasting rights are ones that women's game is really only beginning to grapple with. The Deloitte Football Money League is a genuinely useful document. It gives us consistent data on how revenue has grown across the top leagues in world football over nearly 3 decades. The trends it captures, the rise of broadcasting, the increasing importance of commercial income, and the growing dominance of a small number of clubs are real and worth understanding. But as we've looked at, it measures just one thing, the top line, and that tells us an incomplete story. When you see a club near the top of the list, the right questions aren't just how much did they earn, they're also how much did they spend? What is their wage ratio? How much debt are they carrying? How much of this year's revenue will they generate again next year? And what does any of this tell us about the club's relationship with its supporters, its community, its players? Those are the questions that sit behind the numbers, and the Money League is a useful lens, but it's one lens focused on one dimension of what football clubs actually are. So when you see a club near the top of this list, the right questions aren't necessarily how much did they earn, but they're also how much did they spend? What is their wage ratio? How much debt are they carrying? How much of this year's revenue will they generate again next year? And what does this tell us about the club's relationship with its supporters, its local community, and its players? These are the questions that sit behind the numbers, and the league is a useful lens, but it's just one lens focused on one dimension of what football clubs actually are. I hope you've enjoyed watching this. I've provided links to the Deloitte's list reports below, the women's list, and the books I've drawn on in writing this video. Thank you for watching.